Welcome everyone to our second episode of Rhodes China podcast. I am Tianyi Wu, your host today. I am DPhil candidate at the Repnikova School of Government, University of Oxford, focusing on the Chinese capital internationalization strategy in Africa. We're very thrilled to have Professor Maria Repnikova today to join us. Maria is an associate professor in global communication at Georgia State University. Maria is a scholar on Chinese political communication and the author of two books, Media Politics in China, Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism, and Chinese Soft Power. She was a Wilson Fellow from 2020 to 2021 at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholar. In the past, Maria was a post-doctoral fellow at the Project for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the Annenberg School for Communication, University of Pennsylvania. She received her doctorate DPhil in politics here at Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. Maria speaks fluent Mandarin, Russian, and Spanish. Thank you for joining us today, Maria.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be virtually back with you guys at Oxford.
Great. I want to begin by asking you on one of your recent articles on The Atlantic on Chinese attitudes towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The first question I have in mind is, are there any disagreements within the Chinese public and political spheres on the Ukraine situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, it's hard to trace at times those frictions or disagreements because they're not always publicly as visible. I think in the early stages and maybe even mid stages of the war, we have seen some disagreements on social media, especially some netizens and even organizers of various petitions expressing some discontent with the official policy, but not directly targeting, I think, the policy, but more so showcasing some humanity towards Ukraine, the victims of Russia's aggression, and basically positioning themselves as an alternative voice, a different voice on this issue, in contrast to the official voice and a lot of nationalistic sentiments that are expressed online that tend to kind of favor Russia and be heavily anti-Western. So I think we have seen some of these, I think, more humane voices, but unfortunately, many of them got censored or disappeared in terms of, just they got deleted. So we don't really have a chance to follow through to see what impact they had. I think privately, I imagine many people have shared maybe mixed views about this war. It's a very complex war, but at the same time, it's still ongoing. And, some of the reporting has sort of waned in the West, but also in China. So maybe some people are less concerned with the war at the moment. But I imagine if you ask them personally, there will be some mixed views, including some empathy. But on social media, it's at times hard to trace that variety because it gets quickly, censored, controlled, and reshaped and dominated by nationalistic voices.
Very interesting. Would you mind just give our audience a more detailed picture of what this nationalistic approach we see coming from the central government?
So from the central government, there's been kind of a consistent stance in terms of this so-called strategic, I don't know if it's ambiguity or middle ground position. It wasn't necessarily nationalistic per se, but the idea is to support peace and the resolution of the conflict, but also oftentimes to sideline kind of the West and suggest that the West was the instigator of this conflict. So basically the notion is that, we are pro-peace, we should end this war and the atrocities. And in very general terms, it's not just, it's not really Russia necessarily that's at fault here. Both sides are part of this conflict, but at the same time, the origins of the conflict are rooted in NATO over-militarization of the region of Eastern Europe and pushing Russia into this war, basically. So I think this narrative of, arguing that the West is guilty as a culprit, it's not Russia. In that sense, it appears to be quite anti-Western. But if you look at the practical actions of the Chinese government, at least up until now, we haven't seen Chinese government helping Russia militarily or economically on any kind of large scale, or supporting it directly by saying that, China is pro Russia's war, right? We haven't seen that. So it's not completely, I think, aligned with Russia, but it's trying to straddle this very kind of complex middle ground by extending some moral support to Russia indirectly, but also by suggesting that it's all about resolving the conflict and appearing as, China is a responsible global power in line with the West. It's kind of complex set of strategies that Chinese government has been practicing.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, there is a specific point that is anti-West when analyzing the Russian-Ukraine conflict, right?
Right. Yes. The anti-West sentiment and the point that I think was quite striking to me because, I've been following Chinese official propaganda and rhetoric for quite some time, mostly focused on domestic issues, but more recently also external matters. And I guess I was a little struck by just how strongly anti-Western some of these arguments were, especially in cyber diplomacy. You see some Chinese official spokespeople very overtly arguing this point about the West, and not only just that the West is guilty or is the key oppressor or instigator of the conflict, but also using this kind of two-sided or whataboutism sort of rhetoric, suggesting that U.S. has done X number of war crimes, has committed all kinds of war crimes as part of its own aggressive behavior in the international sphere. Afghanistan, Iraq, there are plenty of examples, and therefore it has no moral legitimacy. So it has no moral right to critique Russia or to critique anybody for that matter. So it's not only that the US is guilty of supporting NATO and being the key member and militarizing the region, but also it's just not a moral power to begin with. So we just have no sense of trusting the US anymore. So there were all kinds of different attacks, on the US, direct and indirect narratives. I think they were quite opportunistic, maybe for some of these diplomats or spokespeople. It's a way to showcase that they're patriotic and maybe to appear strong and defending China's interests. Maybe it's a bit performative as well, but it definitely was a strong expression that I think also resonated and was channeled by many nationalistic voices on social media. So we still see some convergence there across those different platforms, official voices, nationalistic voices. It's not just, the spokespeople, it's also just regular people who are discussing some of these matters.
I'd like to go a bit deeper on this fixation upon the morphosis of the West and having a very contradictory conflict, even though the West is not necessarily the center of this Russia-Ukraine conflict, but the way we're seeing right now is in the media, anti-West sentiment has become one of the core image producing here. So I want to ask, how common do you see or witness this anti-West sentiment amongst both Chinese netizens, but also how common it has become in general in Chinese foreign policy rhetoric?
Well, that's something that I'm actually tracing at the moment. So I don't have completely definitive answers yet, but I do see that it's becoming increasingly more common. And I think especially the West, if we substitute the West for the US, we see an anti-American sentiment. I would say the Trump era in particular, I think, has really transformed some of these discussions. And when I was studying the media and external kind of propaganda persuasion pre-Trump, I learned that, the US was kind of depicted in somewhat neutral terms. You're not supposed to criticize, directly attack the US in Chinese media. But after Trump got elected and all this antagonistic comments coming out from him towards China, and there's been a kind of a shift. And I think there's been a lot of anti-American commentary that was allowed to flow freely in Chinese media. So that to me seems like kind of like a change. Maybe that's one of the turning points in terms of anti-Western, anti-US discourse. But I think more broadly, there's also just a sensitivity about the West, the power of the West. Something that I'm currently looking at in the project on Chinese soft power in Africa is just how much of you said this amorphous vision of the West is being entwined in Chinese thinking of its own role, its own kind of moral positioning, what it's offering, globally, but also what it's trying to battle. So the key focus is often on Western hegemony, right? But not just in terms of economic resources, but culture, language, and soft power, all those different kind of more, one would say kind of more less tangible, sort of things are dominated by the West. And it's very clear in Chinese discourses that if not for the West, China would be more successful in terms of its discourse power, its rhetoric, its ability to communicate its messaging. But because the Western media is so anti-China, that's how it's being seen, at least from Chinese perspective, it's really trying to attack China and not understanding China correctly. That's why Chinese voice is being kind of it's being sort of cut off, or it's being critiqued. So there's definitely this discontent about the West and this notion that in order for China to truly rise as a great power, they need to win more of this kind of right to speak in the international system and to kind of push back on Western hegemony. So there's a really interesting relationship there, I think, with imaginary West or the understanding of the West. And in some ways, I think it's quite exaggerated, right? If you think about Western media, is it really that effective, right? If you study media or communication, if you ask a scholar of communication in terms of just the media effects, you might say, well, actually, people don't even pay attention to some of these messages, or they're not really consuming them. But from the Chinese official perspective, it seems that Western media is positioned as this really powerful actor, as if it has this kind of direct effects, kind of as soon as people read it, they believe the messages. I think that's an interesting perspective, but it doesn't get untangled, at least from what I've seen in Chinese debates. There's kind of an assumption that's being made. So it's a very interesting, I think, deeper discussion or analysis we need about just this notion, the idea, the visualization of the West, Western hegemony, where it comes from, and how it's being portrayed as kind of a target to beat or to contest in the future.
So in a sense, this anti-West sentiment also derives from the imagination of a strong soft power from the United States, if I anti-West or from the West in general, and then the narratives comes out of as a contradictory power or contradictory measurement, so that they have their own soft power origins and then addressed to their own audience.
Yeah, so I think the understanding overall is that soft power is a very important arsenal of kind of Western power, and especially the US power in the international system. So US has kind of mastered it, or it's good at it, or it has this potential to influence, shape public opinion. So there's on the one hand this kind of aspiration or admiration, because if you think about soft power as a concept, it came from the US, it got integrated, into Chinese political thinking, not only China, but also Russia, Iran, many countries where it got sort of traveled and been reincorporated or transformed for local context. But nonetheless, this assumption that, yeah, we should be kind of like the US, we should maybe mimic or learn or adopt some of these tactics. But at the same time, the US is also sort of a threat because it does have this discourse power, this kind of ability to control, right, international discourse and communication. As a result of that, it's also something we should be wary of and kind of push back on. So on the one hand, there's a sense that we should be like the US. On the other hand, we should beat the US. And, it's a dangerous force to reckon with. So it's somewhat contradictory, I think, how the West is being seen. And by the West, I think the US is often the key player.
Just as you mentioned, in the context of US-China antagonism, and also the fact that in a lot of cases we're seeing Chinese media or Chinese propaganda try to derive its own discursive power, many debates, as I've noticed, have centered on ideology, culture, and political value in foreign policy, as you mentioned. And one of your recent articles, The Balance of Soft Power, the Americans and Chinese quest to win the hearts and minds, highlight the different approaches for the two countries in achieving soft power. So just for our audience that will not necessarily follow the arena for consistently, would you mind give us a basic portrait of what are these values that the Chinese are trying to propose or challenge against the soft power we see are at the very core in the US foreign policies?
Yeah, so first of all, when we think about Chinese kind of conceptualization of soft power, I think it's more fluid than the way it's being seen in the US or has been originally understood in the US. So if you look at the American soft power, the definition that Nye provided was, values, foreign policy, and culture are the key resources of soft power. And soft power is being seen as distinct from economic power and coercive kind of military power. That was his original definition that he later kind of transformed or developed a new concept of smart power that combines hard and soft. So, first of all, from the very beginning, soft power is quite amorphous. If you think about even Nye's definition, there has been many critiques by IR theorists and scholars that this is just too broad, too vague, and like, how do you ever measure this thing? Like, what does it really mean? So that's just, one point to make. But then I think still it's somewhat a little bit more, not precise, but a little bit more narrow than what has been discussed in China, where on the one hand, when it comes to resources of soft power, as you said at the beginning, there's all kinds of resources. Material resources, economic governance model is one of China's sort of soft power potential resources or emblems of its soft power, but also its ideology, traditional culture, history, all kinds of arsenal. Some scholars even talk about technology, China is, selling or developing. So anything that kind of shows off China's prowess and image is seen as part of its soft power. And oftentimes I think the material and the cultural are very much interconnected, more interconnected than they are, say, in the US. So we see in practice, oftentimes deliberate fusion of, material offerings and kind of values. So for example, this idea of community of shared destiny or the mutuality that's often being stressed by Xi Jinping and other, high-ranking officials in their speeches, this notion that, we're in this kind of shared community together. But what is this community? It's all about kind of give and take and reciprocity and shared development, right? It's not just about one-sided zero-sum game. That's how they portray the US. But the shared development is very much rooted in economic development. So we're developing fast, so we can offer you some lessons, we can offer you resources, loans, and all sorts of help in order for you to become developed as well. So it's sort of like China extending its hand and saying that, we're still a developing country, And we want this kind of community of developing countries to benefit from what we've learned and what we're doing. So kind of a benevolent, partner and neighbor in many cases. So much of his diplomacy is focused on Asia, Southeast Asia in particular. So a lot of it's kind of about extending hand and this promotion of mutuality, mutual giving and sharing, and creating something that's more, I guess, equitable, in terms of the development model, as opposed to very unequal and, Western centric, the way that it's positioned, or from the Chinese perspective, the way that they see the West. So that's how I think a lot of the speeches are also very much aligned with, various types of plans and projects, and you're studying the economic side of it, right, say in Africa, but we see so much of the narratives combining kind of, there's a speech, but there's also a plan. There's always some sort of a project that's being aligned with the speech. There's an investment project or a trade fair or some kind of summit where various agreements are being signed on the economic front. So the cultural kind of touring China and the ideological of this values of sharing and community of shared destiny, and this China as being this power that does not intrude in your domestic interests, it doesn't control your agenda. It's all about kind of give and take and creating something better and more equitable. But at the same time, here are some resources for that. So it's not just talk, it's actual practical resources. That's why in this article, I talk about Chinese soft power as being in some ways more pragmatic, because it comes with various benefits, direct benefits, whereas US soft power is often very much values oriented. And by values, I mean liberal democratic values, but not always supported by resources. So I think that's a big difference between Chinese and US soft power.
Interesting differentiation. I couldn't help thinking about what's your thoughts on this effort from China, more so on the central level, try to present itself as a new development partner, a new development alternative. As we mentioned, a lot of economic development practices that has shown with great effect in Chinese own domestic development, and is now sort of transferring to its developmental partner in the global south. And I, based on a lot of research, for example, Ethiopia has been one of the major partners adopting a lot of development values in terms of strong leadership, strong center state control in employee industrial policies. So I wonder, what's your opinion on how effective is Chinese soft power in relations to its international audience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so overall, if you look at the effectiveness, depends on how we measure it. Again, what would mean by effectiveness, right? So if you talk about kind of just public opinion polling on how favorably they see China, which is a very typical instrument, that's how a lot of, if you look at the articles about China's soft power just in the media, you'll see that's how effectiveness is often measured. So if you look at public opinion polling, then in the West, it's been declining. The favorability has been declining. So it's increasingly negative views about China in Western countries and in liberal kind of industrialized democracies, not only, in Europe or the US, but also Australia, I guess New Zealand and Japan. So it's kind of an array of countries that tend to see China rather negatively in recent years. And it seems that whatever China is doing, whether it's the Olympics or COVID diplomacy, it hasn't really helped to alter that image. But if you look at developing countries, now the term most used is global south, we do see some differences there. In particular, the polling from Africa, but also Latin America suggests that there is some distinction there, more positive, sentiments about China, but at the very least, the numbers are more positive. So if you look at kind of the scale of polling, and that people tend to see China as a relatively favorable partner, and oftentimes in addition to the US, it's not just seen as the most favorable, but it's also both of them are seen as favorable choices. So a very different picture there. But at the same time, if you go beyond the kind of public opinion polls, which is just one instrument and oftentimes hard to measure the deeper sentiments, because people are just asked to fill out a survey and sometimes they're in a rush and it's not really clear in what conditions they're really doing this survey work. But when you're asking them through interviews or focus groups, I think the sentiments are very contradictory. They're very mixed. So you mentioned Ethiopia in your comments, and my book is drawing on a lot of research in Ethiopia. So even in the context where there's so much supposedly synergy, right, between China and Ethiopia in governance aspirations and exchanges that have been taking place between the two countries, and so much economic involvement from China and political involvement as well. When you interview elites, journalists, and officials, you find that the sentiments are quite contradictory. On the one hand, there's admiration for what China has done, like going to China in particular, I think is a very transformative experience for many people, seeing what it has accomplished. But at the same time, I think there are concerns with Chinese kind of dominance, so distrust for what's the future, right? Because even though, say, there are many arguments that dispute the notion of debt trap diplomacy. Empirically, it seems to be not the case. But in terms of perceptions, I think they're still concerned that there are very large loans that are being undertaken, and these projects are very large scale. But who is going to pay for that? What kind of dependencies is this giving rise to? Chinese labor is coming into the country. A lot of rumors about that. Associations with prison labor, oftentimes very difficult to dispute or kind of challenge amongst regular public, but also some elites, and the kind of sense also of just lack of cultural synergy. So even with Confucius Institutes and attempts to engage in this kind of cultural exchange, there often seems to be very deep disconnect and very limited friendships or deeper relationships that are being formed as part of these exchanges. So I think it's some of these relationships that are formed, they're quite strategic, opportunistic. People want to gain something from China. It's useful to have those relationships, but at the same time, you feel like ask a deeper question about how they feel about Chinese values, culture. First of all, many are unaware what those values really are, concerned about China's long-term objectives in Africa, and oftentimes also feeling very disconnected from Chinese culture, almost fearful. So if you look at social media discussions in Amharic and Ethiopia, you see that there are a lot of kind of stereotypes and some racialized depictions also of Chinese culture, Chinese migrants, and so forth. So it's very complex, I think, picture that's difficult to just sum up maybe in one sentence or a very quick summary. But I think, again, public opinion polls relatively positive, but beneath that, the deeper conversations and interviews suggest more mixed views, including, I think, a mix of admiration and fear and suspicion. I think that's maybe a more accurate sense, but at the same time, easier to say 70% of people like China than saying that, oh yeah, there's this mixed sort of sentiment. It's hard to have a quantitative sort of depiction of that. So I think there's sort of a reluctance to use those kind of complex sentiments to describe the understanding of China, because it's hard to come up with numbers that support that. It's something that's much more qualitative, right, in terms of its the research approach and what we derive from that. So both are good, I think, but I think they have to complement each other. If you only look at the numbers, you might come up with only one side of the story.
So does this complexity that you've just mentioned suggest that, for starter, I think there are a lot of favoritism for China coming from more associated with its economic power, and you, as you mentioned, this concrete value or concrete support they gain, whether it's loan or economic support or chances to go to China. Then my question is, how important really is soft power? Because from the understanding of soft power, it seems that China has not necessarily gained a lot of support from its partner in the global south. And some posit that soft power blends into hard power. And in this case, as long as China can continue to support African partners or partners in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, they can view China as an alternative finance partner opposed to OECD or DACA or United States. So soft power is only effective if only deployed as sharp power to change the hearts of mind. Just wondering your opinion on that.
I think it depends if we take the definition of soft power in kind of the traditional nice sense of definition of soft power and saying that it's just culture, values, and foreign policy. So economic power is separate. In that case, one could say, yeah, it's not that effective because just culture by itself doesn't seem to be a very strong instrument. And if you read Chinese writings as well, there's often quite a lot of discussion, right, of challenges that China is facing in terms of its cultural exports, the fact that it's only exporting traditional culture, the fact that there's less of a commercial kind of, attraction, say, to Chinese films or music, popular culture element is not as developed. Many, many critiques or understandings, discussions of challenges. So if you look at the traditional definition, if we're not taking into account the economic part as part of soft power, then one could say that it's not doing as well. But if you look at the Chinese definition or conception of soft power, where I think economic aspect is sort of fused into soft power, so it's a lot more, again, fluid and kind of all-encompassing. So even if it's suggesting that it's economic governance model as part of its soft power, then one could say that maybe it does have some effectiveness, if you look at the perspective of Chinese own interpretation of soft power. So if it's much more amorphous, if economic side of it is actually, as you said, bleeding into this sort of cultural side, then perhaps it has had some effectiveness, some success in shaping public opinion. But I think the other side of it is also, what is China trying to accomplish in its soft power? What are the motivations? If the motivations are just to get higher public opinion polls or people to just love China and have this deep affinity towards China, maybe that's a mixed picture, right? On the one hand, public opinion polls are maybe higher, but at the same time, I think Chinese official rhetoric is so focused on the West, right? So winning the West and beating the West. So if the Western public opinion is always, not always, but consistently declining recently vis-a-vis China, then I guess that's seen sort of as a failure, like it's not working. And even though global South seems to be rising, it's not enough to say that China is successful. You still kind of want the West to be also shifting in different direction. But if you think about the motivations as kind of supporting China, maybe to create a different image of itself internationally, I think a lot of these relationships they're forming in Africa with elites themselves who visit China, or journalists who then tell really positive stories about China, for international audiences, kind of the kind of co-perform this very positive, benevolent image of China that can be helpful because it gives China an extra voice, kind of legitimates China in the international space, but also domestically. You see that there's a lot of promotion that China is a generous country, right? It's helping all these countries develop. It's benevolent. It's this great power. But if you want to show yourself as a great power, you have to have people from elsewhere say that. Otherwise, it doesn't sound very credible. So if you have all this global South, elites or just general public and expressing good things about China for domestic media as well, I think it's actually a pretty positive thing for legitimation for suggesting that China is rising. So I think a lot of this soft power audience in the context of China is also domestic. It's not just international, but also just Chinese citizens who are told to believe that China is a great power, and as a result, to kind of admire what the regime has been doing and to continue to support it, because after all, it's a one-party state, so it has no elections, and you can't really sort of shift things easily. So it's important to continue to manufacture support and consent.
Would you mind go a bit deeper into this interesting point you mentioned, that the presence of a domestic audience as part of the Chinese soft power audience?
Sure. Yeah. So it's also, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, the domestic part, I think it's very important, often underlooked, or I think not really noted that much in Western discussions of soft power, because again, in the context of Nye's definition, it's really externally oriented. It's about global, I think, publics and foreign policy being kind of the key arena where soft power is being implemented. But in the context of China, when you look at the readings, oftentimes they talk about domestic publics, and in particular this notion of national rejuvenation and cultural security, confidence, this idea that somehow there isn't enough confidence in Chinese culture at home. So by making China more powerful internationally, by making its culture attractive, appealing, admired elsewhere, it's going to also appear as more attractive domestically. So kind of like the inverse, right? Sort of this notion that if somebody likes us over there, then maybe we're actually doing pretty well, so we should kind of like ourselves better. So it's interesting, kind of maybe in some ways with a bit of a weird confidence boosting sort of idea. But I think a lot of the soft power discussion is really focused on domestic kind of legitimation, coherence, cultural rejuvenation, and this kind of idea of, again, aligning behind the party. Sometimes that's expressed implicitly, but I think that's obviously the main goal. So domestic public opinion really, I think, really matters, and that's why sometimes we see also this outburst of nationalistic commentaries on Twitter by spokespeople and China spokespeople and so forth. I don't think it's always aimed at the international public, because obviously messages like that are not effective with American audiences. If you're just constantly berating America's democracy, I don't think that's anybody's really attracted to that, right, in the US. Mm-hmm. But domestically, it's very attractive because it looks like, hey, the US is not that great and we're actually doing better, or it creates a lot of room for conversation and very kind of patriotic tones. So in that sense, maybe it is, powerful, but not for external, more for domestic consumption.
And what do you think in terms of how effective that this specific strategy targeting domestic audience and boosting Chinese soft power has been? The term 文化自信, cultural confidence. I agree with you in a lot of sense that it's more targeting toward domestic audience rather than the other way around. But at the same time, this sort of narrative, how effective has it been if you look at the national context?
Yeah, I think it's a little tricky because cultural confidence is also a bit of a amorphous term. What does it mean? How do you measure that? And I guess it's almost impossible to measure cultural confidence on any kind of large scale, because it's just a difficult question to ask. How do you ask that? Are you confident in your culture? Then you have to kind of specify, what is this culture? What is Chinese culture? And I think a lot of the culture that's being sold abroad, right, is again, it's traditional culture, which many, I think younger Chinese generations probably don't practice as much. It's not something that's everyday. It's not an everyday kind of existence. It's something that's more of a, so you learn it, but that you don't necessarily practice it. So what is Chinese culture? What are the key domains of that? And, how do we kind of create a coherent vision of this culture? I don't think that's completely clear when it comes to the rhetoric about cultural confidence. And sometimes I think it's kind of a substitute for maybe political confidence, like having confidence in your political system. It seems to be kind of a subtle message behind that you should be confident in how things are going basically in China and whether or not we're successful. So if that's the case, then I think maybe it does spur up quite a bit of nationalistic support. And in terms of, China being a strong power, in many ways outpacing the United States, but also helping all these countries in the global South and just, becoming this major player, I think, the major voice in the international system. So I think that can be seen as quite successful, but doesn't mean that there's a cultural confidence. I think that's maybe not quite the case, or at least it's very, very difficult to determine that. So sometimes to me, it seems that cultural confidence is sort of a bit of a softer substitute for kind of political confidence or confidence in Chinese political system.
Very interesting point. I'm Chinese, and coming from a Chinese media landscape, a lot of time when I observe this, it seems to be polarized, specifically on the role of media in buttressing the idea of boosting confidence. On one hand, you do see more grassroots support following, for example, Weibo, whenever there's a spokesman posting ideas or text on how they're against US or against, in general, West democracy, and then showcasing their own achievement. But on the other hand, it seems that a lot of people who are not necessarily tweeting or Weiboing, that they're not agreeing with what they say, but because of censorship, their sentiment has not been reflected.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just, there's definitely a variety of public sentiments, like we talked about at the beginning, even about the war in Ukraine, but of course about many issues, including US democracy. I think it's in going back to this notion of the West as being this, on the one hand, admired sort of entity, and of course very much imaginary, on the other hand, something that's being resisted, right, and kind of critiqued. I think there's this contradictory and interesting sentiment there. And you do see that also on social media, that I think many young people have, of course, either studied in the US or consume American popular culture. And there's some sense of maybe affinity, even if it's not admiration, some sense of kind of closeness. At the same time, there's this nationalistic campaign and sentiments about, critiquing and pushing back on, Western dominance. And I think at the same time, just the more nuanced perspectives, they're always there, but they're just, they're deleted, but also they can be overpowered by nationalistic sentiments, and not necessarily deleted, but you just don't see them as, or they're kind of have less followers or likes or clicks or whatever you call it, they're less shared, they're less visible, social media. And that's not unique to China. I think if you look at Twitter, right, kind of politics, we also see that sometimes the loudest voices are not the most nuanced, that just happen to be the most provocative. So that kind of is a deeper question about just the role of social media in creating room for conversation, for debate versus polarization. So that maybe is not unique to Chinese landscape, but because of censorship, it aggravates this division.
I want to center on the role of social media, or the role on media in general. The conventional thinking on media is that their capacity is there to hold their government accountable, as evident by media traditions embedded within Western liberal democracies. But when it comes to China's one-party state, this view seems both practically futile and prospectively hard to realize. Many hold the view that Chinese media is a passive agent of the party state machine, probably as a tool for their imagination of soft power, as an agent to deliver these goals. But at the same time, some critical journals, magazines, and grassroots social medias are increasingly active in engaging with social debates, especially on issues from, for example, the Chan mother of 8 to recent lockdown in Shanghai. We see a lot of content generating from the grassroots media. So do you see the room for media debate and dissent as shrinking, expanding, or evolving into different forms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the kind of the popular view is that it's shrinking. That's sort of been the consensus if you look at just the way that it's been depicted. The media space has been depicted in the media, but also Western media, but also various public debates. But I think it's both in some ways maybe shrinking, but also evolving and developing into new forms. So on the one hand, I think the traditional media landscape, when we look at critical journalism, that's something I've studied and looked at in my first book. I think definitely there's some shrinkage there. We just see that there's more pressure on journalists from a variety of angles, from political to commercial pressures. People just not consuming traditional media as much, so there's less income and less kind of advertising revenue for those media. That's not unique, of course, to China, but then also a lot of more political pressure under Xi Jinping, just a lot more regulations and call for ideological kind of allegiance to the party, and less space for deeper coverage of critical matters. So there's, I think, some degree of shrinkage, and also investigative journalists exiting the profession. So we see quite a lot of kind of outflow of those really talented individuals who have lots of experience going into public relations or other more lucrative forms of employment, basically, that are less politicized, so they can make money and be left in peace, right? So that's sort of been the phenomena of the past, I guess, 5-6 years. We see some of this professional shrinkage also. At the same time, I think it's not completely dead. So for one, we do still see some pretty impressive investigative and in-depth reporting carried out on some topics. For example, as you mentioned, COVID lockdown, but also even the beginning when the outbreak in Wuhan, we've seen some very in-depth pieces from Caixin, for instance, that I found quite impressive, and I don't think they were actually censored. So I was able to find them like much later, still available online, 10, 15-page reports, articles, very in-depth critiques of how things were mishandled in Wuhan, and in some ways alluding to some central level governance issues as well. But in that particular moment, there was a lot of coverage from all over, some of these semi-critical, I would say, editions or journals and newspapers kind of galvanizing around this particular crisis. So in moments of crisis, major crisis points, we do see some discussion and some investigations, some critiques, human interest reporting coming out still. Those issues, the topics, I think in some ways are different, in some ways similar to the past, pre-C kind of era. On the one hand, I think more societal kind of topics, right? So not necessarily as political, but social issues. I think environmental degradation, environmental issues are still very, widely covered and discussed. The lockdown, of course, it affects everybody. So it was so controversial. People were talking about it from the bottom up to some media outlets. We also see like gender politics and, sexual harassment and just gender relations as being covered quite a bit in various forms. So corruption on different levels, maybe not the highest, but still, I think some lower level corruption in governance and lack of governance effectiveness is being covered. So there's quite a lot of issues that are still, I think, being engaged with, even in some traditional media. And I think crisis points often give kind of a bit of a breakage point, because it's less easy for censorship apparatus to immediately crack down. They don't know what the event is yet. So sometimes there's kind of a bit of a waiting out moment for the crackdown. So there's kind of a small window of opportunity. That's been the case before, and I think it's still the case now. So that's one point. The other point is social media. You already mentioned that there's so much content being generated from the bottom up, and I think that's really impressive, but also just kind of a vital thing to keep examining, because it's not all coming from any traditional sources, but just citizen journalism and regular people posting photos and images and commentaries about what they're experiencing. And that content, because it comes in such high volume, and oftentimes it's not immediately touching on sensitive keywords or topics. The topic might be sensitive, but they're using creative keywords to bypass it for a little while. It maintains kind of its influence for a little while until there's finally a crackdown. So there's always something being regulated, but there's also a lot of creativity in how some of these sentiments and events are being discussed and expressed. So I think that that's really striking, and it suggests that there's always give and take and push and pull, right, in this kind of systems. I think if you look at even Soviet Union in the harshest times, there was always some resistance through the form of samizdat, or like handwriting and hand copying, sensitive documents or novels or reports, literally because there was no social media. You just have to kind of handwrite to be able to maintain or to upkeep some of these very sensitive materials before they're found or burned or whatever. So I think there's always some room for creative resistance. Sometimes I think it becomes a little bit more even more decentralized and more kind of individual centric. So as we mentioned, social media, it's individual people themselves kind of organizing or putting out this content, as opposed to institutions like the media. So that kind of fragmentation of resistance, I think maybe is something that's happening more so in China, which is on the one hand maybe harder to control. On the other hand, it's less organized. It's like it's less of a mobilization that's threatening to the regime. So but it hasn't completely died down. I think there's still a lot of discussion, and if one is studying this type of phenomenon, I think you can still come across really interesting topics and debates to analyze as a scholar or as an observer.
I'm interested in how, as you mentioned, this space for improvisation, the space for media, whether it's traditional media or social media with new forms, in terms of not falling into the chilling effect, the self-censorship, but at the same time, finding space for creative, critical, engaging with social events. What are the mechanisms supporting these potential outbreaks?
You mean the outbreaks of kind of creativity or the well, I think the creativity is, at least if you look at the kind of the larger phenomenon of authoritarian governance or authoritarian regimes, there's always some sort of an interesting, I don't know, interplay between control, coercion, and creative resistance. So I think this creative resistance always exists, and sometimes it even becomes more creative as a result of more coercion because we don't have as much space. We have to come up with a bit more inventive ways to express discontent or even just a sense of self, right? To kind of identify oneself as distinct or not necessarily as aligned with official sentiments. So even if you're not against the party, you might be able to find a way to express some alternative views, or at least to identify as having a unique voice, right? To be able to share something different about a topic that's maybe somewhat controversial. So I think creativity is, in some ways, it's actually become reinforced with more coercion because one has to come up with new ways to assert one's individuality, basically. And that's been the case in any political system that's highly coercive. We see this also in the context of the US and kind of the micro level of certain, I would call it kind of maybe bottom-up authoritarianism in the context of states here, the red states, where you just see coercion when it comes to women's rights and all kinds of other measures where people have to find ways to kind of mobilize and organize. And sometimes when I look at that here, living in a conservative state in Georgia, you see that some of these conversations are not that dissimilar from what's happening in authoritarian regimes, right? It's like there's ways to try to find hidden resistance, to mobilize across kind of subset of groups that are not as visible, or to find ways to sponsor something, or to find ways to be creative, just the way the signs that are appearing at protests, the way that we're expressing ourselves, more humor, satire, all kinds of indirect sort of poking at the current state of things, right? Not necessarily the whole system, but some things that you're unhappy with or you want to criticize. So I see creativity as kind of a force that always exists alongside with coercion. And I think it's just, to say that control in some ways completely overpowers resistance, I think that's not quite how we observed it throughout history. And I think in China too, we're seeing new kind of interesting seeds of creative resistance always, coming out in unusual spaces, but one has to look for them. So they're not as visible. So if you don't look for them, you might think that this is a completely controlled system. But if you look for them more carefully, or you try to trace certain themes or try to understand some of these symbols, then you find some of these more interesting expressions.
Regarding the creative resistance you mentioned, do you see the current leadership's approach to governance as varying significantly on the way things has been played out? Or are these constraints more strictly embedded or defined?
I think, well, it's both. I think on the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, Xi Jinping's leadership has been more constraining, so just more regulations, more new policies, new ideological kind of not movements, but I think ideological type of policies that call for more kind of undisputed support for the party and just more performative support for the party as well, aligned with or connected with also more control, more censorship. So on the one hand, there's this more restrictions. At the same time, this is a regime that has always been restrictive. So if we think about, the role of the media, I guess we could go back to the Mao period, but also the opening up reform era. It's always been the case that the dominant role has been positioned as guiding public opinion, which is a softer way of saying propaganda, right? Kind of persuasion. So that's always been the dominant role. So I think it's interesting how sometimes the party, some party speeches, like Xi Jinping's speech about media being the mouthpiece of the party, comes out and people are saying, well, this is a complete transformation. But if you think about this, it's not quite the transformation. It's been the case for decades that media should be the dominant voice of the party. And then in addition to that, there's been some encouragement of supervision of public opinion, which means basically reporting on some governance issues and trying to channel public opinion towards the parties, so saying that, well, what do people think? What are they concerned about? Let's fix it. So that's kind of the more investigative, critical media space there, kind of the more supervision of public opinion versus guiding public opinion. So it's very awkward language that is being used, but basically the roles of the media have always been somewhat hierarchical. The dominant role is propaganda, persuasion, and the kind of the subservient, the marginal role is that of basically channeling public grievances upwards for the government to see them, to understand them, and to fix to address these concerns. So that I think hasn't really changed that much. I think it's the same dynamic, but the space itself for this kind of expression of grievances, especially in traditional media, has definitely shrunk. So it's in some ways both. I think the way the system has kind of evolved over time, but also the latest restrictions and the operations and visions of Xi Jinping have changed things quite a bit as well.
As much as I want to follow up with some of the questions, I just realized we only have 10 minutes left. So I'd like to open the opportunity for questions to the audience. Please just simply mute yourself or raise a question in chat if you have any. Okay, I guess some of the audience by formulating their questions in the chat, I will just continue to follow up. So what's your opinion on looking forward, the role of Chinese media, following up our previous discussion? Right now, they are in a very much a landscape that on one hand presents them with new opportunities, but on the other hand, facing a lot of constraints. So what's your opinion on how for media themselves to position their own role in the society? And in general, what is there a strategy from a top-down level in either constrain or viewing them as a strategic agent to deliver particularly political goals?
Oh, I think moving forward, at least for now, I don't see, I guess, a huge transformation from what is happening today, because for one, I don't think we're going to have a new leader, anytime soon. So it's the same leadership. So it seems that that's kind of a constant, and his views are pretty clear. So, it's not, I guess, very hopeful in terms of the media space somehow like opening up again. So I think one thing we haven't maybe mentioned yet, but it's not just, in some ways, there's a constancy in terms of media serving this propaganda role. At the same time, there's been kind of shrinking and opening of the space for more critical voices over, I guess, contemporary history the past 30, 40 years. And it seems like there was some expectation at the beginning that maybe under Xi there'll be kind of a bit of an opening sort of space for more expressions, more critiques, a little bit more loosening of restrictions, but that hasn't happened. It's been the opposite. So it seems a bit unlikely to me, at least. I'm not very optimistic about that loosening happening anytime soon. So it appears to be maybe more tensions, more frictions between this increasingly dominant propaganda role of the media and the resistance. Well, I don't even know how to call it resistance, a creative dissent or creative communication expression from below. And I think a lot of it will be carried out by citizen journalists and social media, kind of in social media spaces, not necessarily just traditional media itself. I think a lot of the events, it's already the case that a lot of breaking events are happening or taking place online, and more of the kind of social media dynamics are going to be at the centerpiece of this frictions, as opposed to, say, traditional media kind of carrying on this role of maybe supervising or trying to be an accountability agent when it comes to the party. I think a lot of traditional media, unfortunately, because of that space limitation and lack of funding, and just the fact that traditional media is kind of shrinking in general, it's going to be hard to play this role of holding the party at any level, very accountable. So I think that's one element that I'm seeing. So I guess I'm imagining there's going to be more of similar dynamics that we're seeing today, but maybe more, even more interplay on social media and more attention that we have to pay to crises, or kind of breaking events or crises of all kinds, whether it's national crisis or smaller scale crisis events, and how they shape or reshape public perceptions and debates, and whether or not some of these critiques are turning to more sensitive territory of questioning systems. Like I think during the Wuhan pandemic outbreak, there was some questioning of censorship at certain points, and also during the COVID lockdown, some sentiments coming out were quite hostile towards the entire system, not just individual officials at the local level. So I think what I'm watching for is to what extent some of these usually quite localized critiques that focus on local issues, local officials, how much are they starting to kind of shift and sway towards higher level issues, like demanding more freedom of speech, or critiquing larger policies of the party state, or critiquing, I think very rarely Xi Jinping himself, but some higher level officials. So is it really a shift in kind of how critique is expressed, who they're targeting, or is it still staying at the micro level, very subtle, creative, but not quite as radical? So that's something that I think is really interesting to observe, because if it's not as radical, in many ways, it's not quite a threat, right, to the party. It's manageable to contain.
Do you think some of the support may gaining from international arena? For example, the cases you mentioned as creative resistance, this very vibrant media engagement that are necessarily very much reported or appreciated in the international realm. But if we're looking at major Western media, for example, The Guardian, the New York Times, they don't particularly represent, for example, UK or United States, but people view them as independent news sources. So for news agencies, they themselves doesn't necessarily have to heavily rely on their own government to give them approvals or give them permissions to report. So I'm wondering if this internationally, if there is a mechanism to support this lack of space.
Yeah, I think international media, I mean, they're doing their best to come up with, I guess, deeper investigative stories, but the problem is that they're also facing restrictions. At least Western media, I think American media, several outlets have been basically, I don't know if the word expelled is the right word, but pushed out of China or, Beijing in particular. And many of these journalists are operating from Taiwan and from Seoul. So there's kind of this sort of reporting China from the borderlands, almost like you're kind of there, but you're not really in mainland China. So it's very difficult to report on some of these stories. So we see some of these issues already arising in some of the coverage that it's just not coming right directly from the source. So that's, I think, the pressure on international media is also, quite extensive. But at the same time, we still do see some stories coming out from, The Guardian, BBC, some other outlets that maybe still have a little bit more space. Sometimes other European outlets that are not in English language because they're less maybe easy to disseminate, are coming up with really interesting stories. Unfortunately, I can't read, for instance, German, but there's some really interesting coverage of China coming out in German for the German audience. So there is still some room, but from what at least I hear from, this is not, kind of research based, but just, having interactions and friends in the Western journalistic community in China, that it's getting harder and harder to do their job as well. Like it's not as fun anymore, because people, not only officials, but people are suspicious. They don't want to take on the risk of speaking to a Western journalist. It's just not, there's no gain for that. There's very little, the gain from talking to this journalist, practically nothing, but they face some risks. Maybe they're going to be punished. Maybe somebody will find out. Maybe somebody will see them talking to them, or whatever it is. It's seen as a risk. So I, at least from my kind of conversations, I see that journalists themselves are feeling a little bit, frustrated or kind of stressed in terms of how do you navigate this space. It's not just official restrictions, but it's the public engagement, or like if you want to do good stories, you need public kind of engagement, relationships. You need people to be at least sometimes willing to talk to you. Otherwise, it's not a very good story. So I think it's becoming more difficult, just like it is for researchers, but also for journalists.
It seems like a vicious circle in all sorts of directions. I know it's a very hard question, but aside from waiting, or aside from hoping that things change, do you think there is any point or any perspective that, whether it's from academia or from journalists, that they can actively engage with?
Well, I still think that active engagement is not completely, off the table, especially once China opens up. I hope with the COVID restrictions loosening, being able to visit again and to engage in conferences or exchanges. At least from the academic point of view, I think that from what I hear and know from China's scholar community here in the US, everybody wants to go back. There's no question that we're all, eager to return, to see our colleagues there, to interact, to learn, to kind of re-engage with how things have changed in China in the past 2-3 years. So I think there is this kind of eagerness and openness. So looking beyond the political level, like at the political level, I think the relationship between the US and China in particular is very dire kind of, waters. It's not really improving. But beyond the kind of political layer, if you look at, say, scholars, academics, at least from I think the US side, there's definitely an interest to engage. And I think from Chinese side too, if there's an opportunity there's definitely, I think, still a desire to learn, to communicate, to co-publish, to exchange ideas. So that to me is still kind of hopeful space. I think student exchanges, cultural exchanges, beyond kind of just, again, the state, let's say Fulbright programs, like things like that, I think are very powerful. Unfortunately, there are not as many of these programs left, but reinstating them and expanding them, I think would be a very good idea. And I'm just speaking about the US here, but I think the same thing goes for Europe and European, students. I think the interest in China is still very immense. So in terms of exploiting that interest and allowing for these connections to develop organically, not necessarily kind of let's improve, I don't know, Britain, China relations, like, an attempt can be made, but can we really change that as individuals? I don't know, we can contribute, but the the current mood is very negative, pessimistic, at least in the US. But beyond that political mode, I think there's still quite a lot of interest in the language and the culture, but I think also just amongst the scholars, the experts, there's definitely a desire to engage. So I'm hopeful a little bit on that front, but I guess it remains to be seen what the return will be like. Will we be able to do research? I'm not saying openly completely because it's never fully easy or anything, but will we be able to kind of carry on some of these projects? Is there space to do conferences together? Can Chinese scholars travel here and attend conferences? At the last Asian Studies conference here, many of them weren't allowed to participate even on Zoom. So there was, kind of like, is there room? Is there actually feasibility to engage with each other, or is it going to be very, very constrained? So it's very hard to talk openly about these issues. So a lot of it is quite unknown, but I think the interest is there, but how the conditions will allow for this or permit for this kind of exchanges, that's maybe a little bit of a mystery for now.
Do you think the momentum will much more likely from a political level? I'm thinking about what is the future of both Chinese diplomacy, but also in general, how the international society reacts to the Chinese diplomacy, because right now we're very much seeing antagonism, but how sustainable and effective would this in general anti-West or anti-US rhetoric offense being in existence, or is there another way from international community to change from a very antagonistic confrontational perspective instead of finding cooperative more cooperation approach?
I think, unfortunately, the cooperation approach is marginalized, in terms of how China is being talked about here, say in Washington and the US, but also how the US is being talked about in China. It seems like there's a lot of disillusion in one another and what the motivations are for this, relationship, and global motivations as well. Kind of seeing each other as really competing. At the competition framework, I think, is being embraced as on both sides. It's like we're competing. There's the sense that, it's not quite, we can't really fit together in this very smooth collaboration. But I think on some issues, maybe there's a little bit of hope on issues related to climate change or public health, crisis management, like issues that are more specific and maybe very much important to both. There's a little bit of a space for a more collaborative approach, but I think it's going to be kind of issue by issue versus like overarching framework changing. Because if you look at the Biden administration, there was again hope that we're going to see a change from Trump, but it's not that big of a change. If you look at the speech Blinken has recently made, it seems to be still very much oriented towards seeing China as kind of one of the key forces in geopolitics that one has to contend with and compete with, and basically try to kind of manage and in some ways not push back necessarily, but to kind of try to mitigate some of the negative effects that are being caused by China's rise. And in China, of course, the speech was also taken with quite a lot of critique. So it's unfortunately, I don't think I see too much room for transformation of the framework, but I think maybe there's a little bit of hope on some very specific issues. And that's going to be dealt with by very specific communities of scholars or experts, policymakers, only working on those issues. So that's some hope there. But again, will they be able to agree on something if the overarching framework is very negative? I guess it's hard to know. If you're overall seeing each other as competitors, will you agree on something related to climate change or other matters that are kind of existential? Or is politics going to be the key variable, like ideology and politics are going to take over the other issues? And as a result, climate change becomes kind of a, brushed aside as, maybe less significant or unmanageable. So that sounds pretty scary, but I hope that doesn't happen. But again, kind of, I guess, being, located here in the States and engaging a lot with the DC community, I'm a little bit pessimistic about big changes.
In related to this overarching negative concept and expectations, there's one question coming from the chat from Jing Gao. She's asking, where do you think the suspicion or mistrust from people in other non-Western countries of China comes from? And does it mostly related to the colonial history and intrinsic carefulness about external impacts, the mainstream image of China in Western countries' media, the specific practice of Chinese businesses in those countries, or something else? Is this inevitable, or do you think there are chances for improvements? Which I think the latter question you've just addressed a little bit. But what's your opinion on what is the source of this deeply rooted mistrust?
It's a great question. I think you already note here in your own question quite a few factors, including I think the colonial experience. Of course, the history of colonialism and domination is very much deeply rooted in national identity of many of these countries, especially if we think about Africa. Having seen what kind of relationships emerge from some of these I guess, unequal power dynamics. There is a concern of neocolonialism or neo-imperialism. Not necessarily those terms are being used, but I think the kind of the agitation or the anxiety is in some ways maybe resembling some of these experiences of the past, or at least reminding of what may happen if this influence is uncontrolled or unmanaged. But I think also the media, if you look at Chinese interpretation, they would mostly say it's the Western media. So which is really, I think, fascinating to me. There's so little discussion of the actual deeper roots of these perceptions in non-Western countries, including the colonial history, legacies, and so forth, and also lack of China's own, I guess one could say, relatively successful cultural engagement kind of policies and so forth. But I think in the Chinese interpretation is often, if not for Western media, it will be very much successful. So that's also quite interesting. In the business malpractice, I think the kind of disconnect between state and non-state actors, I think is a huge, really interesting topic of research in terms of China's image promotion, non-state actors, and also some state actors, whether it's SOEs, but also private businesses and Chinese traders, migrant communities around the world and in the global South in particular. Perhaps they have their own, of course, practices, identities, goals, motivations, oftentimes very different from what the Chinese state is trying to project. So they're not there to promote China's image or to create some kind of a benevolent relationship or whatever it is. They're there to make money too. They have very specific practical goals. And so as a result, they are often the faces of China, but they're not quite representing that policy that the Chinese government is trying to push forward. So lots of these factors, I think they're kind of dancing along one another in creating some of these challenges. Is it completely inevitable to manage them? I think there are some ways to manage them by, I think in some ways, doing just better public diplomacy. And I think that's something that Chinese scholars also talk about, how to improve telling the China story, promoting some of these policies, but also trying to maybe in some ways manage or regulate the activities of these non-state actors. And I think there's a lot of, at least from what I heard when it comes to diplomatic work on the ground, say in Africa, a lot of the focus is on these non-state communities. So like, how do you manage Chinese communities, regulating their activities without them kind of becoming a crisis, and as a result catching the eye of the local media and community organizers and making it really damaging for Chinese image. So I think some of this work is already being done, but one of the bigger issues I think is acknowledging maybe some of these, not failures, but some of these issues publicly, right? So a lot of Chinese storytelling is so positive, it's so focused on the good sides of what China is doing and giving, but the bad sides, and any country, any major power faces pressures and limitations. I think sometimes it's difficult for, let's say, Chinese state media to acknowledge some of these weaknesses, in part because of censorship and maybe fear of appearing as weak, or maybe it's also bureaucratic pressures, not wanting to upset one's superior, or all kinds of different reasons for that. But unfortunately, the storytelling becomes a little bit too positive and sometimes difficult to believe or to kind of absorb, because it just doesn't have enough complexity and humility, right, to acknowledge that some things are not done right and one could do better. So that's a much bigger challenge. And I think that's harder to change without changing the media system and the larger thinking about soft power and diplomacy.
I couldn't agree more. I think misconceptions come from, on one hand, mostly the idea of you have a monolithic China, especially from an international perspective, from the West perspective, but not acknowledging that the reality is far more complex. Like Maria just mentioned, there are many non-state actors, even within state actors. There are so many different entities coming from different bureaucracies, having their own agendas. But there are these are the stories that perhaps not very common to international audience. But on the other hand, the quality of Chinese media itself, its own engagement to promote its image in the international realm is still very immature. Hence, the stories promoted by Chinese media or from central government seems to be less credible from a different point of view. Thank you so much, Maria, for giving us such a comprehensive perspective in Chinese media, propaganda, and soft power. 3 very much complicated thoughts. And we're very glad to have you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation, very inspiring for my current research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.